The rain in Seattle had a way of softening everything it touched. Streets shimmered under streetlights, puddles rippled beneath passing tires, and every reflection seemed to hold a little mystery. Grace Porter stood beneath the awning outside the arrival gate, gripping a damp cardboard sign that read, "Liam Hartley, welcome to Seattle." Her cousin Hannah had begged her to help out that morning when the weather had already promised chaos. Hannah was a wedding planner and had been pulled into a last-minute fitting emergency. Just this once, Grace thought, just a favor. She wore her oversized denim jacket. Her dark curls half-pinned her tote bag, slung across her shoulder with sketchbooks poking out. The voice-over of her own conscience could have belonged in a movie trailer. She only meant to do a favor for her cousin, but fate had a different passenger waiting. Inside the terminal, voices echoed through the air like background music. Arrival screens blinked, the smell of coffee mixed with rain-soaked coats. Grace checked the sign again. Maybe he would recognize his name first. Maybe she would not even need to speak. That was always easier for her. Crowds spilled out of Gate 14 in waves of winter coats, and then she saw him, a tall man in his mid-30s with dark hair slightly mussed from the flight, wearing a charcoal coat and carrying a sleek leather bag. He looked exhausted but composed, scanning the crowd with quiet focus. When his eyes landed on the sign, she was holding a flicker of relief crossed his face. Grace lifted the sign a little higher. "Mr. Hartley," she asked as he approached, "I am Grace Hannah's cousin. I am here to pick you up." He exhaled with a small chuckle, as if the entire airport had been an obstacle course. "Oh, thank God. The traffic outside is already insane." His voice carried a calm authority, softened by fatigue. He offered his hand briefly. Ethan Reeves did not correct her. He assumed the mistake belonged to his assistant, who had arranged a car for him, and apparently mixed the names. It was easier to go along than explain. They walked toward the sliding doors as cold air rushed in. Grace led him to her car, a slightly dented hatchback that smelled faintly of turpentine and lemon soap. "Sorry, it is not luxury," she said. "My cousin usually handles all the professional clients I am. Just the stand-in tonight. It is perfectly fine," he said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror once they were on the road. Outside, the city glowed under sheets of rain. Windshield wipers kept a steady rhythm. Grace tried to fill the silence with something safe. "I teach art part-time, mostly for kids with hearing loss," she said, eyes on the road. "I guess I am better at painting than talking." Ethan smiled faintly, his tone low and deliberate. "That is a rare thing these days, people who actually listen." Grace laughed under her breath. "Maybe because listening is how I earn a living." The heater groaned to life. Raindrops traced lazy paths down the glass. For a moment, the city lights blurred into watercolor. The more he listened, the more Ethan found himself forgetting the constant ticking of his life deadlines meeting shareholders. The world outside her car felt suspended in soft light. She was genuine in a way that disarmed him. The ride took longer than planned because of traffic near Pine Street. Grace glanced at the clock and said, "You are probably starving." "The hotel restaurant might be closed already. There is a small cafe right around the corner if you do not mind." He nodded without hesitation. "I would not survive another hour without caffeine." They parked under a flickering street lamp. Inside the cafe smelled of cinnamon and roasted beans. The walls were lined with sketches and Polaroids from local artists. Grace felt instantly at home. They sat by the window, where rain kept sliding down the glass in silver threads. She ordered black coffee for him, a caramel latte for herself. Their conversation drifted from travel to art to why people chase success. He told her he grew up in Boston, then moved to the West Coast, chasing a dream that had started in a dorm room. She shared that she once wanted to be a full-time painter, but teaching felt more meaningful now. When she laughed, her eyes crinkled, and her fingers unconsciously brushed the paint stain on her sleeve. Ethan found himself studying the way she moved with quiet curiosity. There was nothing calculated in her gestures, no trace of the corporate world he lived in. He had been surrounded for years by people who spoke in numbers and margins. She spoke in color. Grace noticed the faint lines of exhaustion on his face, the kind that came from years of carrying too much responsibility. She wondered what he did exactly, but she did not ask. The mystery felt oddly comforting. When the rain eased, she stood and smiled. "It was nice meeting you, Mr. Hartley. I hope Seattle treats you kindly." She offered her hand again, quick, polite, professional. He took it gently, his palm warm against hers. "You too, Grace Porter." He said her name slowly, as if memorizing it. Outside, she pulled her jacket tight and disappeared into the misty air, her steps soft against the wet pavement. Ethan watched her leave until the reflection of her figure dissolved into the glass. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and the illusion shattered. Dozens of notifications glowed across the screenboard meeting in 15 minutes. Press wants statement Revo quarterly review. His assistant had texted Sir your driver, for Mr. Hartley is still waiting at gate 14. Ethan exhaled, leaning back in the booth, realization dawning with a quiet laugh. The woman who had just walked out into the rain was not his scheduled driver at all. She was simply a stranger who had picked up the wrong man. Yet as he looked out into the Seattle night, Ethan Reeves, the billionaire CEO who had built an empire from nothing, realized it was the first peaceful hour he had lived in years. The morning light crept through thin curtains and brushed against the small apartment in Capitol Hill where Grace Porter lived. The walls were the color of faded vanilla, half covered with children's drawings and paper butterflies made by her students. The air smelled faintly of acrylic paint and coffee grounds left from last night. Grace sat at her tiny kitchen table, a mug of lukewarm coffee in one hand and her sketchbook open before her. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same image, the man from the airport sitting across from her in that small cafe. His dark eyes calm and kind beneath the flickering light. She told herself it was silly. He was probably halfway to a business meeting. Someone important, someone who had already forgotten her name. Still, her pencil moved almost by instinct. Lines formed across the page, capturing the curve of his jaw, the tired gentleness of his expression. The drawing came alive faster than she expected, and when she finally looked down, she whispered to herself, "What are you doing, Grace?" She shut the sketchbook with a quick slap and sighed. The clock on the stove read 7:45. She was late again. Across the city, glass towers gleamed under a gray sky. Ethan Reeves sat in his office on the 48th floor of Revo's headquarters. The view stretched across the harbor ferries, cutting through mist traffic, crawling like silver ants. He wore a white shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his tie hanging loose. In front of him, the board agenda lay open untouched. His assistant knocked hesitantly. "Good morning, sir. Your meeting with the investors starts in 10. He nodded, distracted, and waved her off. On the corner of his desk sat a disposable coffee cup with a faint lipstick print near the rim. He had not thrown it away. For some reason, it felt wrong, too. He reached for it and stared at the smudge like it was a message written in invisible ink. His phone buzzed. Another reminder board meeting press, follow-up economic forecast. He turned it face down and leaned back. For a moment, he could still hear her laugh, the way she had described painting with children who could not hear but could feel color. They listen with their eyes, she had said. It had struck him like poetry. No one in his world talked like that anymore. He opened his laptop out of habit, typing her name into the search bar, half hoping nothing would come up. And of course, nothing did. She existed only in his memory, a kind stranger in the rain. Still, his thoughts refused to focus. When his chief financial officer started the meeting, words blurred into static. He excused himself midway, claiming a migraine. The truth was less medical and more emotional. He simply wanted to breathe outside the skyscraper's sterile air. Back in her apartment, Grace rushed through getting ready. She tied her hair into a messy bun, grabbed her canvas tote, and dashed out into the drizzle. The streets shimmered with puddles, and she could see her breath in the cold air. The 7 bus rumbled toward the community center where she worked. On the way, her phone pinged. It was a message from Hannah. "Morning, 'cause hope yesterday went smoothly." "Did Liam find you okay?" Grace frowned, thumbs flying. "Yeah, everything was fine. He was nice, actually. Quiet, kinda tired." The reply came seconds later. "Wait, Liam missed his flight yesterday. He just texted me. He's landing this morning." Grace froze mid-step. A man bumped her shoulder, muttering an apology, but she barely heard it. The sound of the city faded into a dull hum. If that wasn't Liam, then who had she spent the evening with? The realization came like a slow ripple. He must have thought she was someone else too. She pressed her lips together, half embarrassed, half amused. "Great!" She muttered to herself, "You literally kidnapped a stranger from the airport." By the time she reached the community art room, the children were already unpacking. Brushes and jars of paint. Mrs. Porter, one little girl, signed enthusiastically before speaking aloud with effort. "Can we paint the rain today?" Grace smiled, trying to shake off her thoughts. "Sure," she said softly. "Today we paint what we see outside." The kids cheered, dipping brushes into bright blues and grays. As they worked, she wandered between tables, correcting strokes, guiding small hands, steadying jars. But every now and then, her gaze drifted toward the window, where drizzle streaked down the glass. She caught herself wondering what he was doing right now. Around noon, she sat with her lunch in the staff room, flipping through her sketchbook. The drawing of him stared back almost lifelike. She traced the outline with her thumb. Maybe she would never see him again. Maybe that was okay. Not everything needed to be finished. Some sketches were meant to stay sketches. On the opposite side of the city, Ethan Reeves stepped out of an elevator into the lobby of a hotel. He had canceled 2 afternoon meetings. His driver looked at him curiously, but Ethan simply said, "I need to clear my head." He ordered coffee and sat by a window overlooking the street. A violinist played softly nearby, the tune mingling with the rain. He opened his notebook, not the business one, the small leather one he rarely used. On the first page, he wrote in clean, deliberate handwriting, "Grace Porter." Underneath, he added 2 words, Airport Cafe. Then he closed it and smiled faintly at himself. He did not know why, but writing her name felt like anchoring something real in a world of transactions. By late afternoon, Grace returned home soaked and tired. The city lights flickered on painting gold reflections across wet asphalt. She poured herself tea and sat near the window, the sound of rain, a soft heartbeat against the glass. Her phone vibrated again. A message from Hannah popped up with a picture of a man at the airport waving. "Here's the real Liam finally." She typed back quickly with a nervous laugh. "Don't ask, long story promise, I didn't commit a crime." Hannah sent a string of laughing emojis and a heart. Grace placed the phone aside and opened her sketchbook again. She looked at his drawn eyes and whispered, "Whoever you were, thank you for the coffee." Then she added something she rarely did, a small note at the corner of the drawing. "The stranger who reminded me that kindness still exists." Across town, Ethan stood by the tall windows of his office, watching the same rain fall over the same city. His assistant asked if he needed anything. He shook his head. As the elevator doors closed behind her, he reached for the cup with the lipstick mark once more. He thought of her smile, the way she held her coffee with both hands as if warming herself from the inside out. He had met thousands of people, but none had left silence so heavy and comforting at the same time. Outside, thunder rolled faintly. He turned off the lights, letting the city illuminate the glass. Somewhere in the maze of Seattle, someone was probably sketching while listening to the same rain. And for reasons he could not explain, Ethan Reeves felt the smallest spark of hope that maybe fate was not finished with him yet. 3 days passed before fate decided to stir the still water again. Seattle had been gray and restless rain, moving like silk threads over the city skyline. Grace Porter was on her lunch break, sitting near the window of a small bookstore cafe, with her sketchbook open, tracing outlines of strangers passing outside. She had promised herself to stop thinking about the airport man, to stop replaying his voice or the way he had looked at her with quiet interest. But some people linger like echoes. She flipped to a new page, determined to draw anything else. At that same hour, Ethan Reeves was in his boardroom, surrounded by charts and predictions. His mind, however, was not in the room. His assistant was giving an update about Revo's new product launch. But all he could hear was the faint sound of rain against the glass. When the meeting ended, he remained seated, fingers drumming on the table. A notification popped up on his phone. An article shared by a friend, community artist, inspires deaf children through paint. The headline caught his attention. He clicked it almost absently and froze when the photo loaded. There she was standing in a classroom filled with colors, and children smiling with her hair pulled back and her hands covered in blue paint. The caption read, "Grace Porter Art Teacher, Capitol Hill." Something inside him shifted. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. Without thinking, he whispered her name. 2 days later, he stood outside the same community center, umbrella in hand. He had told his driver to wait a block away, not wanting attention. Through the glass doors, he saw her kneeling beside a young boy, showing him how to mix yellow and green. Her movements were calm, patient, her voice gentle. The children adored her. He almost turned back. This was her world, not his. But when she looked up and caught his reflection through the glass, her expression froze in surprise. She excused herself and walked to the door, pulling it open against the rain. "Mr. Reeves," she said uncertainly, as if testing if she had the right name this time. He smiled softly. "You recognized me? Hard not to. You're standing in the rain wearing a suit. People like you don't usually appear at art centers unannounced." She tried to sound calm, but her heart had already started to beat faster. He chuckled, glancing at the dripping umbrella. "Fair point. I was nearby and saw the article about your work. I thought I'd stop in and see it myself." Her brow furrowed. That article had no comments section, no donor link, no reason to attract a CEO's curiosity. Still, she nodded. "Come in, just watch your step." Inside, the smell of paint and crayons filled the air. Children peeked curiously at the tall stranger. Ethan crouched beside one of them, smiling as a little girl signed hello with shy fingers. Grace watched as he awkwardly copied the gesture until the girl giggled. It was strangely endearing. She had expected arrogance or distance, but instead he moved with genuine care. When the class ended, she walked him to the door. "Thank you for stopping by. The kids don't get visitors like you very often." He tilted his head amused. "Like me? You mean overworked, underslept, and constantly on the phone." She laughed softly. "Something like that." He hesitated before asking, "Would you have coffee with me again?" She blinked, surprised. "You don't even drink coffee. You barely touched it last time." He smiled a little. "You noticed? I'd settle for tea then." "I owe you at least that much for rescuing me from the airport chaos." That evening they met at a corner cafe near Pike Place Market. Rain tapped gently on the windows, music low and mellow in the background. Grace ordered chamomile while Ethan took black tea. Between sips, their conversation unfolded effortlessly, as if they had picked up where the night at the airport left off. She talked about how art gave children a language when words failed them. He listened with quiet admiration, occasionally asking questions that showed he had really heard her. When she asked about his work, he hesitated. "Technology," he said finally. "But lately I wonder if it's just noise." She tilted her head, studying him. "Noise can be beautiful if you listen differently." That made him laugh. "You make everything sound poetic." "Only when it rains," she replied. Days turned into small coincidences. He stopped by the center once a week, claiming he was donating supplies. She found a new shipment of brushes and paints arriving mysteriously labeled "Anonymous Donor." When she confronted him, he only smiled. "I'm not very good at hiding, am I?" "You're terrible at it," she said, "but thank you." He shrugged. "I just believe in what you're doing." One Friday afternoon, he invited her to a private exhibit opening downtown. She hesitated. Those events are for sponsors and critics, not for teachers who wear paint-stained sweaters. Ethan's eyes softened. "Maybe they need more people like you then." She smiled despite herself. "All right, but if I trip in front of a millionaire, you're catching me. Deal." The gallery gleamed under soft golden light. Grace felt out of place among sleek suits and champagne glasses, until she noticed Ethan watching her, not the crowd. When he introduced her to a few guests, he didn't use the word teacher. He said, "This is Grace Porter, the artist who paints what kindness feels like." The phrase stayed with her long after the applause around a sculpture faded. Later, they slipped outside onto the quiet street. The rain had returned, but softer now, misting against their faces. She looked up at him, the glow of streetlights reflected in her eyes. "You don't have to keep pretending to belong in my world," she said. He shook his head. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe your world is what's real. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence like music. Then he reached out and brushed a streak of blue paint from her cheek, the same color she'd been using that morning. "Now you're perfect," he murmured. Grace felt warmth rush to her face. She stepped back, but couldn't stop smiling. That night when she got home, she found a text from him. "Next Friday, Gasworks Park, if it rains again, bring your sketchbook." She laughed softly, typing back, "In Seattle, it always rains." Across the city, Ethan closed his phone and looked out at the shimmering skyline. For the first time in years, the rain didn't feel lonely. The following Friday, true to Seattle's reputation, the sky opened up in a soft, steady drizzle that blurred the edges of the city into watercolor. Grace Porter pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she crossed the wet grass of Gasworks Park, clutching her sketchbook under one arm. The lake shimmered like glass, and the air smelled of wet leaves and earth. She spotted him immediately standing near the rail, overlooking the water, his coat dark against the gray horizon. Ethan Reeves turned as she approached, the faintest smile curving his lips. "You came." "Of course I did," she said. "You said to bring my sketchbook. I don't ignore artistic orders." He chuckled, brushing a few raindrops from his hair. "I thought we'd sit here for a while. It's quiet." She followed him to a bench sheltered beneath a wide oak tree. The city stretched beyond them, cranes, rising lights flickering in the mist. For a moment, neither spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence, just the kind that carried more meaning than words could. Grace opened her sketchbook and began to draw the skyline, the water, the faint outline of the man sitting beside her. Ethan glanced over her shoulder. "You make this look peaceful," he murmured. "I've never seen this city as peaceful." She smiled faintly. "Maybe you've been looking at it from too high up." He turned toward her, surprised. "From up there, it's all deadlines and numbers. Down here, the rain makes everyone equal." They spent the afternoon talking about everything and nothing. She told him about her father, who used to fix bicycles and teach her how to mix colors using house paint. He told her about his mother, a pianist who never got to see him play anything but boardroom games. Grace laughed when he tried to describe coding in metaphors, and he listened like it was the first time someone's laughter had cut through the fog of his mind. The rain picked up, tapping rhythmically on the tree leaves. She held out her hand, catching a few drops. "When you were a kid, did you ever just stand in the rain until you were soaked?" she asked. He thought for a second. "I don't think I ever allowed myself that luxury." "Then maybe you should try it now." She stood stepping out from under the tree, spinning once like a child. Her laughter carried across the park, unguarded and pure. Ethan hesitated, then walked out after her, reins caking through his hair and coat. "You're insane," he said, grinning. "You needed proof that perfection isn't about staying dry," she replied. He watched her for a long moment, the way her hair clung to her face, the way her eyes shone brighter than the city lights. It was ridiculous and beautiful all at once. Later they found shelter in a small food truck, parked by the path, steam rising from cups of cocoa. Grace's cheeks were pink, her fingers wrapped around the paper cup. He studied her quietly. "You really love what you do, don't you?" "Teaching," she said. "It's not always easy, but yes, it's honest." He nodded slowly. "I envy that. You could have it too," she said. "What's stopping you?" His expression shifted, a trace of guilt behind his calm. Maybe I forgot what honesty feels like. She tilted her head, curious. You say things like you're confessing them. He laughed softly. Maybe I am. Over the next weeks, they found reasons to see each other again. Sometimes it was coffee after her class. Sometimes it was a quick lunch between his meetings. They never called them dates, but everyone around them could tell something gentle and dangerous was unfolding. One Sunday, he took her to an old warehouse downtown, converted into a private art exhibit. The walls were covered in modern installations, all sharp angles and cold light. Grace paused before a piece made entirely of broken mirrors suspended in wire. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He looked at her reflection in the shards. "It's chaos pretending to be art," he said. She smiled. "Isn't that what we all are?" As they walked along the waterfront afterward, the sky cleared for the first time in days. Sunlight spilled across the wet pavement, turning puddles into mirrors. She stopped to take a photo, and he watched her, realizing he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be present with another human being. No strategy, no image, just presence. A week later, he visited her art class unannounced. The children erupted into laughter when he tried to paint a simple apple and ended up with something that looked like a melting balloon. Grace leaned over his shoulder, giggling. "You're hopeless." He turned to her, feigning offense. "In my defense, I run a multi-billion-dollar company. I can't be good at everything." "Maybe that's the problem," she teased. "You've forgotten what it's like to fail beautifully." He looked at her, eyes soft. "You make even failure sound poetic." She shrugged, smiling. "Maybe it's because I've done a lot of it." That evening after class, he offered to walk her home. The city hummed with traffic and distant music from open windows. They paused at a crosswalk, and for a moment she looked up at him, rain beating on his lashes. "I still don't know why you keep showing up," she said quietly. "Because it's the only part of my day that feels real," he answered. The words hung between them, heavy and electric. She looked away, her breath shaky. "You shouldn't say things like that unless you mean them. I do." His voice was low, steady. "Then mean them slower," she whispered. He walked her to her apartment door, neither wanting to leave. She turned, offering a small smile. "You should get some rest, CEO. You look like a man who hasn't slept in years." He chuckled softly. "Maybe I'll dream in color tonight." She hesitated before stepping inside. "Good night, Ethan." When the door closed, he stood there for a long moment, under the flickering hallway light. He realized he hadn't felt this kind of ache since before success had found him. It wasn't pain, it was the quiet recognition of being alive. Back inside, Grace leaned against the door, her heart thundering. She opened her sketchbook and began a draw without thinking. The image came easily, a man standing in the rain, looking up at a lighted window. When she finished, she smiled through tears she couldn't explain. Somewhere across the city, Ethan stood in front of his floor-to-ceiling window, staring at the rain streaking down the glass. His reflection looked less like a CEO and more like the man she had unknowingly seen, the one trying to find meaning again. Outside, thunder rolled softly over Lake Union. The city kept moving, unaware that somewhere between art and ambition, two souls had quietly found something worth believing in. The scandal began with a single photograph. It appeared on a gossip site early Monday morning, a grainy shot of Ethan Reeves sitting across from Grace Porter in a small coffee shop, sunlight spilling through the window, her hand mid-gesture as she laughed. The caption read, Revo CEO spotted with mystery woman romance, or distraction ahead of IPO. By noon, the picture had been shared across every major tech blog, twisted into headlines that sold better than truth. Grace first heard about it at the art center when one of her students' parents showed her the article, chuckling innocently. Is this you, dear? It looks just like you. Grace froze the color draining from her face. Her phone buzzed nonstop, calls from unknown numbers, notifications, social media tags. When she opened her inbox, it was flooded with messages from journalists asking for statements from strangers, telling her she was lucky or shameful or both. By afternoon, the local news station had parked a van outside the center. Cameras pointed toward the building, reporters shouting questions she couldn't answer. Who is Grace Porter? How long have you known him? Are you involved romantically? She turned off her phone, her hands trembling. Across town, Ethan sat in his office, watching the chaos unfold on a wall of screens. His PR director stood at the door, voice sharp. We need a statement, sir. This is blowing up. Investors are panicking. The board wants you to clarify the nature of your relationship. Ethan's jaw tightened. There's no statement. It's personal. Personal doesn't exist when you run a company worth $50 billion, she snapped. He exhaled slowly. Then tell them this Revo doesn't comment on personal lives. That's all. She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly and left. The moment the door shut, Ethan leaned back and stared at the rain streaking down the glass. He thought of Grace's small studio, her world of crayons and laughter, and the storm he had just dragged into it. That night, Grace returned home exhausted. Reporters had followed her halfway to her apartment until a neighbor chased them off. She sat on the floor back against the couch, her phone vibrating endlessly on the table. When she finally checked it, there were dozens of missed calls from Hannah. Grace, what is happening? Her cousin's voice came through, panicked when she called back. The news says you're dating Ethan Reeves. Who's Ethan Reeves? Grace stopped mid-sentence as her mind caught up. Ethan Reeves, CEO of Revo. The realization hit her like cold water. The man she'd met at the airport, the man she thought was just some tired traveler, was one of the most powerful people in Seattle. She sank into silence. Oh my God, Hannah whispered. You didn't know? No, Grace said quietly. I had no idea. The next day, the comments turned cruel. Online forums called her a gold digger, an opportunist. Someone leaked an old photo from her social media of her classroom, with the caption, Art teacher uses kids to charm billionaire. The world twisted her into a caricature of greed. Grace stopped checking her phone. She stopped leaving her apartment. Even the sketchbook stayed closed on the table. 2 nights later, a knock came at her door. She opened it hesitantly to find Ethan standing in the hallway, his coat soaked from the rain, eyes tired but resolute. Grace, please let me explain. She stared at him, anger and disbelief mixing inside her chest. Explain what? That you lied about who you are, that you let me walk blind into a storm that's now destroying my life. He shook his head quickly. I didn't lie. I just didn't correct you. I wanted one night where I wasn't a CEO, where I could just exist. And what about me? She asked bitterly. I didn't get to choose that. You made me part of your illusion without asking. The words stung more than she expected. He stepped closer, voice low. I never wanted you to be hurt. I should have told you the truth sooner. She crossed her arms tightly. You should have trusted me enough to handle the truth. The hallway light flickered between them, the hum of rain filling the silence. For a moment, his expression softened. "Grace, everything I said to you, everything I felt, it was real." She looked at him, searching for sincerity. "Maybe it was real for you," she said quietly. "For me, it's a mess I have to live with." She stepped back and closed the door before he could answer. His reflection lingered in the peephole, then vanished. Inside, Grace sank onto the couch, covering her face with her hands. She wanted to hate him, but all she felt was tired. She opened her sketchbook and stared at the drawing of him under the rain, the one she'd finished only days before. She dipped her brush into black paint and began covering the page slowly, the color spreading like grief. In his penthouse across the city, Ethan sat by the window, watching news anchors dissect his silence. Every channel replayed the same photo of them at the cafe. His phone buzzed with messages from the board demanding action. One of them had even suggested a temporary leave until the scandal cooled down. He poured himself a glass of scotch and ignored them all. The city below shimmered like circuitry, alive and cold. He had built an empire that connected millions of people, yet he had managed to hurt the only one who mattered. 2 days later, Grace returned to the art center to find reporters waiting again. She pushed through quietly, avoiding their questions. The kids ran up to her, hugging her legs. "Mrs. Porter, don't be sad," one little boy signed. "You're our favorite teacher." She smiled weakly, signing back, "I'm okay." But she wasn't. That evening, she wrote her resignation letter, leaving it on the director's desk with trembling hands. That night, Ethan held a meeting with his executives. One of them spoke bluntly. "Sir, with respect, this woman has become a liability. The market is losing confidence." Ethan looked up, his gaze sharp as glass. "She's not a liability. She's the only part of this entire story that's honest." The room went silent. He stood and left, ignoring their protests. He drove to her apartment again, but the lights were off. Through the window, he saw only darkness. On the doorstep lay an envelope addressed to the landlord. She was gone. Rain hammered the windshield as he parked on the empty street. For the first time in years, Ethan Reeves didn't know what to do next. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes, and whispered her name like a prayer. Grace. Somewhere miles away, on a train heading north, Grace watched the city lights fade behind her. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to start over. She held her sketchbook in her lap, its pages heavy with memories she couldn't erase. As the train cut through the darkness, she whispered to herself, "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk away." The city woke up under a pale gray sky, unaware that a single photograph was about to set its gossip circuits on fire. By 8 a.m., every major blog from New York to San Francisco had the same picture plastered across its front page, a candid shot of Ethan Reeves, the notoriously private billionaire CEO of Revo Technologies, sitting across from a woman in a rain-splattered cafe. Her face was turned slightly toward the light, her smile unguarded, and he was watching her in a way that made the world stop. The headline was merciless: "Seattle's most eligible CEO and his mystery girl." Within hours, online, detectives found her name: Grace Porter, art teacher, 30 years old, Capitol Hill. Twitter threads called her the woman who caught the billionaire's eye. The comments were worse. Some called her a gold digger, some a social climber, others a charity case. Strangers picked apart her appearance, her past posts, her every visible detail. as though kindness itself was a scandal. Grace first saw it on a coworker's phone. Someone had tagged her in the comments beneath the photo. For a few seconds she didn't breathe. The familiar cafe background, her own sweater, his unmistakable face. It was all there. Heat rose to her cheeks, confusion and panic colliding in her chest. She excused herself from class and locked herself in the staff bathroom, scrolling through hundreds of messages she hadn't asked for. Questions, accusations, offers, threats. She turned off her phone, gripping the edge of the sink until her knuckles whitened. Outside, the rain had started again, steady and cold, as if the sky itself was apologizing. Across the city, in the 37th floor boardroom of Revo's headquarters, Ethan Reeves was staring at the same photograph on the digital screen. His PR director paced like a storm. "We need a statement now," she said. "The stock is already sliding. People are speculating about insider favors, inappropriate relationships, misuse of funds." "There's nothing inappropriate," Ethan interrupted quietly. "She's not connected to the company. Then say that publicly." She shot back. "Silence looks like guilt." He ran a hand through his hair. The room buzzed with anxiety. He could feel the board's eyes on him, men and women who cared more about perception than people. "No press," he said, finally, voice firm. "This is my responsibility, not hers." The PR director exchanged a look with the CFO. "Ethan," she said gently, "the internet doesn't care about responsibility. It only cares about blame." When the meeting ended, Ethan didn't return to his office. He drove instead, no destination, no plan, just following the rain-slicked roads that cut through the city. He stopped only when he saw the Community Art Center, the one from the article that had led him to Grace weeks ago. Reporters were already outside, huddled beneath umbrellas, cameras ready. His chest tightened. He didn't go in. He couldn't. Not yet. Inside, Grace stood in front of her class, trying to pretend nothing had changed. The children painted, blissfully unaware of the noise outside, but their laughter could only muffle so much. The center's director came to her mid-lesson, eyes full of sympathy. "Grace, honey, maybe you should go home for today. The news vans are making a scene." Grace nodded numbly, washed her hands, and left through the back exit. She walked fast, head down, rain soaking her hair. Every honk, every camera flash behind her felt like an accusation. She wanted to scream that it was all a mistake, that she had no idea who he was, that she was just a woman who happened to be kind to a stranger once. But no one was listening. That night, she sat in her apartment, surrounded by silence. The blinds were closed. The world outside was still spinning, but hers had stopped. Her phone lit up again, dozens of missed calls from Hannah. She answered finally, her voice hollow. "Grace, what is going on?" her cousin demanded. "The news says you're dating Ethan Reeves." Grace stared at the wall. "Who, the CEO of Revo?" "The guy in the photo with you. He's worth billions, Grace." The realization sank in slowly, like ice melting down her spine. The man she'd thought was just another passenger, just another face in the rain, was one of the most powerful men in the country. Her stomach turned. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Oh, Grace," Hannah said softly. "I believe you, but they won't." Hours later, there was a knock at her door. She ignored it. Then came another and another. Finally, she opened it to find Ethan, standing there soaked from the rain, looking nothing like the composed man from the cafe. "Please," he said, voice raw. "Let me explain." She crossed her arms, exhaustion and anger etched into every line of her face. "Explain what that you lied about who you are?" that you watched me walk into this nightmare blind." "I didn't lie," he said quickly. "I just didn't correct you. I wanted one night where no one knew me." "And what about me?" she asked quietly. "You had a choice." "I didn't." His throat tightened. "You're right. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't make this go away. I'll fix it," he promised. "I'll make them stop." "You can't fix this with money," she said, shaking her head. "You can't buy back trust." He stepped closer, desperate. "Grace, I meant every word I said to you. Every laugh, every moment, it was real." Her eyes glistened. Maybe it was, but now it's ruined. She closed the door slowly, gently, as if slamming it would make the pain louder. He stood there for a while, listening to the rain hit the windows before walking away. Over the next days, Grace stopped teaching. The Centers Board had asked her to take a leave of absence until things calmed down. She deleted her social media accounts, changed her number, avoided the news. Strangers still left letters at her door, some supportive, most cruel. One note simply said, "You should be ashamed." She burned it without reading the rest. Ethan faced his own reckoning. The board called an emergency meeting. "This woman," one executive said, "has become a liability. Investors are questioning your judgment." Ethan's gaze was ice. "She's not a liability," he said. "She's a person, and I'm the one who failed her." His words stunned the room into silence. "If the company wants to distance itself from me, fine. But don't you dare put her name in another sentence with this brand." He walked out before anyone could respond. That night, he drove back to her street, parking across from her apartment. Through the window, he saw her silhouette move once, then disappear. He wanted to go to her, to tell her he'd trade every title, every dollar, to undo the damage. But he didn't. He couldn't. The next morning, her landlord found an envelope taped to her door with a single note inside. "Thank you for everything. Please forward my mail." Grace was gone. She had taken her sketchbooks, her paints, and left without a trace. When Ethan learned she'd disappeared, something inside him cracked. He sat alone in his car, under the relentless Seattle rain headlights, blurring against the wet glass. For years, he had built things that lasted network system structures, but he had never learned how to keep a person. He whispered into the quiet, not sure if he wanted the world or himself to hear. "Grace, I'll find a way to make this right." Silence has a strange way of filling the spaces that pain leaves behind. In the weeks after she left Seattle, Grace Porter found herself in a quiet coastal town, 2 hours north, where the air smelled of salt and pine, and the sound of seagulls replaced the city's endless hum. She rented a small attic room above a bakery and spent her mornings helping the owner knead dough in exchange for rent. The work was simple, grounding a rhythm she could follow without thinking. She told no one her real story. When people asked, she said she used to teach art in the city, but needed a break. The truth felt too heavy, too strange, too far from this calm place where no one recognized her face. Her sketchbook lay on the bedside table, closed for days, until one night she finally opened it. Half-finished drawings stared back, like ghosts of another life, the man in the rain, the city skyline, the hands of children covered in paint. She touched the edge of a page, then began a new one slower this time, sketching only the horizon beyond her window. The waves rolled gently under a pale sky. For the first time in weeks, her breathing evened out. Back in Seattle, Ethan Reeves had become a ghost in his own empire. The board had convinced him to step out of public view temporarily until the scandal cooled. He no longer went to interviews or appeared at investor dinners. The media had already moved on to newer controversies, but he couldn't bring himself to care. His days blurred into long hours in the office alone. The skyline that once gave him power now only reminded him of what he'd lost. On his desk lay a single object, a folded napkin from the cafe where he and Grace first met, the one she had scribbled on absent-mindedly while they talked about color. He had kept it without knowing why. The ink had faded, but the curve of her handwriting was still visible. He would pick it up sometimes, trace the lines with his thumb, and think about her laugh echoing between raindrops. The press eventually stopped calling, but silence didn't bring peace. His assistant, Claire, found him one evening staring out the window, his reflection blending with the storm outside. "You haven't eaten all day," she said quietly. He didn't look away from the glass. "Do you ever feel like you built something so big you can't hear yourself inside it anymore?" Claire hesitated. "Sometimes the quiet isn't empty, sir. It's trying to tell you what matters." When she left, Ethan sat down and opened a blank document on his laptop. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat. He typed 3 words, "The Reeves Foundation." He didn't know what shape it would take yet, only that it would be built on something truer than profit. Grace's world became smaller but clearer. She started teaching again, this time a free art class for local children in the community hall by the pier. The kids were shy at first, but her kindness broke through their silence. They painted waves and shells, lighthouses, and sea creatures. She began to find comfort in the simplicity of their joy. Sometimes she would catch herself smiling for no reason, then quickly stop, as if happiness were something she hadn't yet earned back. The bakery owner, Mrs. Whitaker, noticed one afternoon as Grace wiped flour from her hands. "You look lighter these days," she said kindly. Grace smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm learning how to start over." "Starting over doesn't mean forgetting," Mrs. Whitaker replied. "It means remembering differently." In the evenings, Grace walked along the shoreline with her sketchbook. The ocean was always moving, always whispering, in a language she didn't need to translate. She drew until her fingers ached, until the sky turned indigo and stars began to blink awake. Her favorite spot was an old pier where seagulls perched on rusted rails. One night she drew a single figure standing under an umbrella facing the sea. She didn't name him, but she didn't have to. Back in the city, Ethan began dismantling his old life piece by piece. He sold one of his penthouses, cut his board salary, and started visiting small nonprofits around the state offering silent funding. He stayed off camera, insisting the projects speak for themselves. But wherever he went, he carried her lessons with him. How she listened, how she saw people without judgment. Once during a visit to a children's art workshop in Tacoma, he saw a drawing pinned to the wall, a man in a raincoat standing beside a woman with a sketchbook surrounded by color. He froze, recognizing something intimate in its simplicity. "Who drew this?" he asked the teacher. "A student from the coast," she said. "She mailed it in as part of our open call. Lovely piece, isn't it?" He nodded, his chest tightening. That night, back in his apartment, he searched for her name again. Nothing. She had vanished cleanly, like she had never existed outside of his memory. But the ache didn't fade. It simply changed shape, less like fire, more like gravity, pulling him towards something he couldn't yet see. Grace began to rebuild slowly. Word of her gentle teaching spread, and soon the town's small paper published a story about her art classes. It was short, humble, but honest. The headline read, "Artist Teaches Kids to Paint the Sound of the Sea." She clipped it and tucked it into her sketchbook. For the first time since everything fell apart, she felt proud again. That night, as rain tapped softly on the roof, she looked at the unfinished drawing of Ethan she'd once tried to paint over. The gray strokes she'd used to hide his face now looked like shadows of memory. She traced them lightly with her fingertip and whispered, "I hope you're finding peace too." The next morning, the bakery's mail included a thick envelope addressed to her. The handwriting was unfamiliar elegant. Inside was a letterhead marked with a symbol she didn't recognize, a single drop of paint within a circle. The letter read, "Dear Ms. Porter, the Reeves Foundation would be honored to fund your art program for children with hearing loss. We were moved by your dedication and would like to invite you to our upcoming exhibition in partnership with local artists." There was no signature, only a date and an address in Seattle. She stared at it for a long time, her hands trembling slightly. The name Reeves burned in her mind like a returning ghost. She closed the envelope slowly and exhaled. "No," she said softly to herself, "not again." But that night she couldn't sleep. The thought of facing him terrified her. And yet, somewhere deep inside, curiosity sparked a fragile question. She couldn't silence. What if he had changed? What if the silence between them had been teaching them both how to listen again? The morning of the exhibition arrived with the kind of hesitant sunlight that seemed unsure whether it wanted to stay. Grace Porter stood by her window, staring at the letter from the Reeves Foundation one last time. It had been 2 months since she'd read his name, 2 months of silence she had thought would protect her. But now curiosity and fear twined together inside her chest. What if this wasn't about him at all? What if it really was about the art, about the children she'd left behind? She packed her sketchbook, brushed the flour from her coat, and caught the early bus back to Seattle. The closer the city drew, the louder her heart became. The skyline rose ahead, steel glass rain clouds, and with it came every memory she had tried to bury. She stepped off the bus into the chill air, the city's pulse, rushing around her like a memory she wasn't ready to relive. The gallery was tucked between 2 modern towers downtown, its glass facade glowing with soft light. The sign above the entrance read, "Art of Empathy," a celebration of creativity and connection. Her stomach tightened. She almost turned away before a young woman greeted her with a warm smile. "Ms. Porter, thank you for coming. The children's section is right this way. Your work has already gathered quite the crowd." Grace blinked. "My work?" The woman nodded. "Your students' pieces are displayed under your guidance. You inspired this whole theme." Grace followed her inside, heart trembling. The gallery was alive with color murals painted by children from every corner of the state. Splashes of hope on canvas. She could smell the faint mix of paint and polish, hear laughter blending with the low hum of conversation. For a moment, she forgot her fear. Then, from across the room, she saw him. Ethan Reeves stood near the far wall, dressed simply in a charcoal suit. No tie, his posture calm, but his eyes searching. Time seemed to collapse into that single instant. He looked different, tired, maybe softer, but unmistakably him. He saw her at the same moment, his breath catching almost imperceptibly. Neither moved at first. The crowd faded into a blur. Finally, he started walking toward her, his steps deliberate. Grace's pulse roared in her ears. When he stopped a few feet away, his voice was low, almost fragile. "You came." She folded her arms, fighting the tremor in her hands. "I wasn't sure I should. I wasn't sure you would," he said quietly. "But I hoped." They stood in silence until she finally asked, "Why me? Why this exhibit?" Ethan gestured toward the paintings surrounding them. "Because you reminded me what empathy looks like. This foundation, this exhibit, it's not just mine. It's yours too. You changed everything." She shook her head. "You don't get to turn my pain into your redemption story." He winced but didn't look away. "I know. I didn't come here to fix what I broke. I came to show you I learned." The announcer's voice filled the hall, drawing attention to the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Ethan Reeves, founder of the Reeves Foundation." The applause that followed felt distant to Grace, muffled by the rush of her heartbeat. Ethan turned to her. "Please stay." She hesitated, then found herself rooted to the floor. He stepped onto the stage, the light soft against his face. When he spoke, his tone carried none of the corporate polish he was known for. "I spent years believing connection came from innovation, from faster networks and better systems. But I was wrong. True connection starts here." He placed his hand over his heart. "It starts with listening with kindness, with the courage to admit when we've failed someone." The audience listened in silence. He paused, scanning the crowd, until his gaze found Grace again. "A few months ago, I met someone who taught me that lesson the hard way. She didn't ask for attention. She didn't want anything in return. She simply showed up, did something kind, and reminded me what humanity feels like. Tonight's exhibit exists because of her." The curtain behind him lifted, revealing a large framed piece at the center of the wall. Grace gasped softly. It was her drawing, the one she thought she'd lost the sketch of the park bench under rain, the first image she'd ever drawn of him. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, "The mistake that changed everything." Her throat tightened. She could barely breathe as the crowd erupted into applause. Ethan stepped back from the microphone, his voice quiet but clear. "I can't undo the lies I let stand, but I can build something better in their place." The Reeves Foundation will fund programs for art and accessibility, inspired by the teacher who reminded me what truth looks like when it's drawn by hand. Grace stood motionless, tears spilling before she could stop them. The people around her clapped, unaware of the history in her silence. Ethan stepped down from the stage and walked toward her again. The noise faded, the lights dimmed. "I didn't do this to earn forgiveness," he said softly. "I did it because you deserved to be seen, not erased." She wiped her cheeks, unable to meet his eyes. "You don't get to decide what I deserve." "You're right," he admitted, "but I can spend the rest of my life proving that I finally understand." Her voice trembled. "You can't erase what people said, what they did." "No," he said, "but I can make sure it never happens again to someone else." Around them, the exhibition continued, the hum of admiration, the clink of glasses, but they stood in the quiet space between two heartbeats. Grace finally looked up, searching his face. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and was still learning how to stand. "You've changed," she whispered. "So have you," he said. She exhaled a small sound halfway between a sigh and a laugh. "Maybe silence isn't always empty after all." He smiled, almost shy. Maybe it's just waiting for the right words. As the evening wound down, people began to leave their voices fading into the soft rain outside. Grace walked to the painting one last time, fingers brushing the glass. She remembered the night she had drawn it, the rain, the quiet, the feeling of peace she hadn't understood then. It had started with a mistake, but now standing here, she realized mistakes were sometimes just beginnings, disguised as chaos. When she turned, Ethan was still there, watching her from across the room. No grand gestures, no speeches left. Just two people who had finally learned to listen. Outside, the rain had started again, light and steady. Grace stepped into it without her umbrella, tilting her face toward the sky. She heard his footsteps behind her and didn't turn away. For the first time in months, the silence between them didn't hurt. It simply felt like home. The week following the exhibition, Seattle seemed to hold its breath. For the first time in years, the city saw Ethan Reeves not as the untouchable billionaire behind Revo, but as a man who had bared something human in front of a crowd. His speech spread online like wildfire, shared by news outlets and social media pages that had once torn him apart. Clips of him standing before Grace's painting, saying kindness connects us more than technology ever will, were replayed across the country. Some called it rebranding, others called it redemption. For Ethan, it was neither. It was truth finally spoken aloud. But not everyone was ready to forgive. Revo's board was split. Investors feared the foundation announcement would tank their IPO. Headlines questioned his sanity. From CEO to philanthropist, has Ethan Reeves lost his edge? He didn't care. He had spent years calculating worth in numbers, and for once he wanted something that couldn't be measured. When he walked into the press conference that Friday, the room was packed. Cameras flashed like lightning. The hum of anticipation filled the air. Grace watched from home, her heart pounding. The bakery's small television flickered in the background as Mrs. Whitaker poured her coffee. "He's doing it for you, you know," the older woman said softly. Grace shook her head. "He's doing it for himself. Maybe that's okay." The screen showed Ethan standing behind the podium, composed but stripped of his usual armor, no tie, no entourage, just truth. For years he began, I believed progress meant speed, that connection was a matter of devices and data. But I was wrong. Connection begins with people, with art, with empathy, with listening. His voice was steady, but the tremor underneath betrayed how much it cost him. Today, I'm stepping down as CEO of Revo Technologies. The room erupted in murmurs, flashes exploding. He continued calm amid chaos. Revo will transition into a new era under new leadership. My focus will be on something I should have built long ago, a foundation for inclusion and creativity, supporting children who see the world differently. The Reeves Foundation will fund programs that bring art education and accessibility together. A reporter called out, "Mr. Reeves, is this sudden decision related to the controversy with Grace Porter?" Ethan looked up, meeting the cameras head-on. The silence was palpable. "Yes," he said simply. "It began with a mistake, one I'll never regret." Because that mistake reminded me that decency isn't a weakness. It's the only real strength worth having. He pressed a small button on the podium. Behind him, the projector screen lit up with an image. The same sketch Grace had once drawn, the one she thought was gone forever. The words beneath it glowed on the screen, Gate 14, the beginning of everything. The room fell silent. Ethan continued. "This drawing was made by an artist who saw humanity, where others saw convenience. She taught children who listen with their eyes. She taught me how to listen at all. This foundation is built in her honor, not as charity, but as a promise." He stepped back from the podium. Reporters shouted questions, but he didn't answer. He simply said, "That's all," and walked off stage. The footage went viral within hours. Online reactions shifted from outrage to awe. The same comment sections that once tore him down now filled with messages about redemption, courage, and humility. Grace watched it unfold from her small apartment, tears blurring the screen. She didn't know whether to feel proud or terrified. This wasn't supposed to be about her, and yet it always had been. Later that evening, she walked along the pier, the wind cool against her cheeks. The town was quiet except for the distant crash of waves. Her phone buzzed a single message from an unknown number. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you'll see what you inspired. E." She stared at it for a long time before typing back. "I saw, and I hope you mean it." He didn't reply. He didn't have to. Over the following weeks, the Foundation's mission gained momentum. Artists and teachers from all over the country reached out. Grants were offered to schools in need. New centers for deaf and disabled children began construction, and Grace's former art program in Seattle was reinstated with full funding. Her name wasn't mentioned publicly, but those who knew understood. One evening, she found an envelope in her mailbox. Inside was an invitation embossed with silver lettering, "The Reeves Foundation Gala," a celebration of connection. Her instinct was to ignore it, to stay in her small, safe corner of the world. But something deep inside whispered that running from the past wouldn't heal her. It would only keep the silence alive. On the night of the gala, she arrived quietly, wearing a simple navy dress. The hotel ballroom glowed under crystal chandeliers, filled with donors, artists, and families. Cameras flashed, but for once she didn't feel afraid. The stage was set with murals painted by children from across the country, bright swirls of color and joy. She wandered through them, recognizing a few of her students' works. At the center hung one piece larger than the rest, a mural of a bridge, made of hands painted by 100 children working together. She stood staring at it, her chest tightening with emotion. Then she heard his voice. "They said it couldn't be done," Ethan murmured behind her. His tone warm, familiar. She turned slowly. He looked different again, lighter somehow. Not the man crushed by guilt, nor the CEO burdened by image, but someone in between. Human. Real. "You came," he said softly. "I wasn't sure if I should. I'm glad you did." He gestured toward the mural. They called it "The Bridge Between Worlds." The kids came up with the name. Grace smiled faintly. "Sounds like something you'd say." He chuckled. "Maybe I'm learning from better writers." They walked side by side through the hall, the noise fading behind them. When they reached the balcony overlooking the city lights, the air was crisp with the first hint of spring. He turned toward her. "I didn't ask you here to apologize again," he said. "I asked because I wanted you to see what you built without realizing it. This," he motioned toward the glowing windows below, "exists because of you." She looked at him, eyes shimmering. "You built it, Ethan. I just reminded you what mattered." He shook his head. "No, Grace, you reminded me how to feel." For a moment, neither spoke. The city stretched below them, alive and endless. Then she whispered, "You kept your promise." "I'm still keeping it," he replied. "Every day." She nodded slowly, her hand brushing the railing, the cold metal grounding her. Maybe that's enough. He smiled, relief flickering across his face. It's more than enough. They stood in silence as the applause from inside drifted through the open doors. Somewhere behind them, someone announced a toast to new beginnings. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable, yet full of peace. "You know," he said quietly, "it's still raining outside. Seems fitting, doesn't it?" She smiled through the tears she hadn't realized she was holding. Always does in Seattle. The night after the gala, Seattle's streets shimmered with the reflection of city lights, scattered across wet pavement, the kind of glow that made everything feel both fleeting and eternal. Grace Porter walked home slowly, the sound of her heels soft against the sidewalk. She carried with her a strange calm, a quiet acceptance that life had shifted once again. She had seen Ethan not as the billionaire everyone worshipped, or the scandal everyone blamed, but as a man who had chosen humility over power, honesty over pride. That image lingered in her mind like a brush stroke of light across a dark canvas. The following morning, she found a letter slipped under her door. The handwriting was familiar, the ink pressed firmly, as though the words themselves carried weight. It read, "There are moments we don't get to rewrite, only understand. But some stories deserve a second chapter. If you're willing to talk, I'll be at Pine Cafe at 6 p.m. No cameras, no board, just me." She folded the note, her pulse quickening. For a long time, she sat at her table, staring at the rain falling outside her window, wondering if returning would reopen old wounds or finally let them heal. By 5:30, she knew her answer. The same cafe where it all began smelled of roasted coffee and rain. The neon sign flickered faintly in the window. Ethan sat at their old table, a cup untouched before him, his fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. When she entered, the bell above the door chimed softly. He looked up, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she approached, setting her umbrella beside the chair. "You still order the same thing," she said quietly. "Old habits die hard," he replied. She smiled faintly and sat down. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full heavy with everything left unsaid. Finally, she asked, "Why now?" Ethan took a slow breath. "Because I don't want forgiveness to be the last word between us. I want something real, not what we were before, something honest." Grace studied him. The sharpness in his eyes had softened, replaced by something gentler, humbler. "And if honesty means we don't end up together?" she asked. "Then at least we end without pretending," he said. His voice held no desperation, only sincerity. "But I hope we don't end. I hope we begin again." She looked down at her hands. "You hurt me deeply, Ethan. Not because of who you were, but because you let me believe I mattered only to watch me be torn apart." His jaw tightened. "I know, and if I could trade every dollar I've earned to undo that, I would." She met his gaze, her voice softer now. "You can't undo it, but maybe you can build something better from it." A small smile curved his lips. "That's what I'm trying to do." They talked for hours about the foundation, about the children's new art programs, about how strange it was that something born from chaos could create so much good. When the cafe closed, the barista politely hinted that they were the last ones left. Ethan stood and reached for her coat. "Let me walk you home." She hesitated but nodded. Outside, the rain had quieted into a mist that hung in the air like memory. They walked side by side through the quiet streets, neither speaking for a while. The city felt smaller, gentler, as if it too had learned how to breathe again. At her doorstep, she turned to him. "You know this doesn't mean everything's fixed." "I know," he said. "I just want to keep showing up until it feels less broken." She considered that, then whispered, "I can't promise anything." "Then promise nothing," he said with a half smile. "Just don't disappear again." She laughed softly despite herself. "You're persistent, only when it matters." He stepped back as she unlocked the door. "Good night, Grace. Good night, Ethan." She closed the door but didn't move away. On the other side, he lingered for a moment, listening to the faint sound of her footsteps fading inside. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed often, sometimes by chance, sometimes by quiet arrangement. She began helping the foundation curate art programs, visiting schools, and centers rebuilding what she once thought she'd lost. Each time they met, the distance between them grew smaller. One afternoon, during a children's workshop, Ethan stopped by unannounced. Grace was on the floor with a group of kids, guiding their hands through strokes of bright color. He watched from the doorway for a while before she noticed him. "You're late," she teased. "Traffic." He said, though his smile gave away the lie. After class, as they cleaned up, he handed her a small envelope. Inside was a check, her first official grant, under the foundation's name. "You don't have to," she began. "I know," he interrupted gently. "But I want to. It's yours." She looked at him for a long time, something soft and unspoken passing between them. "Thank you," she said finally, "for believing again." "It's you I believe in," he replied. Days turned into weeks, and the tension that had once defined them began to dissolve into something steadier. They worked side by side at community events, shared long coffees after meetings, and only once, she let him drive her to the coast where she'd been hiding months before. The bakery owner greeted them with warm laughter, calling them the couple who found each other in the rain. Grace blushed, but Ethan only smiled. That evening they stood on the pier watching the sun dip below the horizon. The ocean glowed gold and pink, calm and endless. "Funny," she said softly, "how mistakes lead us back to the places we're meant to be." "I used to think mistakes ruined everything," he said. "Now I think they just rewrite the map." She turned toward him, their faces close enough for her to feel his breath. "And where does your map lead now?" "To wherever you are," he whispered. Her heart raced, but instead of pulling away, she let the moment exist, fragile, honest, alive. She smiled faintly. "Then walk slow, Reeves. I'm not in a hurry." "Neither am I," he said. The waves broke softly against the pier, and somewhere a gull cried, into the fading light. They stood together, silent, but connected, the wind carrying away everything they didn't need to say. When they returned to Seattle, life resumed its rhythm: meetings, laughter, late-night calls, quiet gestures. But beneath it all ran a current of something steady and new. A second chance not built on apology, but on choice. A year later, Seattle glowed under a soft spring drizzle, the kind that blurred city lights into watercolor and made the world look like it was painted rather than real. The Reeves Foundation had just opened its newest gallery, a bright open space built not for collectors or critics, but for children. Inside, laughter echoed off white walls splashed with art made by small hands. Grace Porter stood near the entrance, her hair tied loosely, a pencil tucked behind one ear, watching as a group of deaf students presented their first mural to the crowd. Their teacher, once the woman who ran from everything, was now the gallery's artistic director. The walls told her story better than she ever could reign. color, kindness, rebirth. Behind her, she felt a familiar warmth before hearing his voice. You still smell like turpentine and coffee. She turned, smiling. Ethan Reeves stood there casually dressed in a gray sweater and dark jeans, his hair slightly tousled, looking nothing like the billionaire the world once worshipped. Old habits, she replied. And you still manage to show up exactly when I'm about to cry. He grinned, stepping closer. Then my timing's perfect. They stood together watching the children finish signing their applause, a beautiful chorus of movement. Ethan leaned in. You made this possible. We did, she corrected softly. You gave it a home. You gave it a heart, he said, eyes warm. For a moment, silence stretched between them, not empty but sacred, filled with everything they had built from brokenness. Later, after the crowd dispersed, Grace walked through the quiet gallery. Her fingertips brushed the edge of each canvas, tracing stories she'd helped create. Near the far wall hung a new piece, one she hadn't approved, but recognized instantly. It was a painting of an airport at night, rain glistening on the tarmac. A single car waiting under a flickering lamp. Beneath it, the plaque read, "The ride that changed everything." She turned, half laughing, half teary. Ethan stood a few feet away, pretending innocence. You put that here, she accused gently. I thought it deserved a spot, he said, shrugging. It's where everything began. She crossed her arms. You realize I still picked up the wrong guy that day. He smiled, taking a slow step closer. Maybe not the wrong one, just the unexpected one. The lights dimmed slightly as evening settled over the gallery. Grace walked toward him, stopping when they were inches apart. You know, I used to think fate was something that happened to you, she said quietly. Now I think it's just the name we give to choices that feel right. Then what's this, he asked. She looked up, eyes glimmering. A choice. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small glass box. Inside, under clear resin, was a worn wooden pencil, its tip dulled paint. Smudged the same one she'd dropped the day they met at the airport. You kept it? She whispered, her throat tight. It's the only thing I didn't know how to throw away, he said. He handed it to her, his voice lower now. I've been waiting a year to give this back. I thought maybe tonight you'd let me keep it for good. Her breath caught. Ethan, marry me, he said simply. No grand speech, no cameras, no boardrooms, just him and her, and the quiet rain pressing against the glass. Not because I owe you anything, or because it makes sense, but because I can't imagine building a future that doesn't start with you. For a long time, Grace said nothing. She stared at the small glass box, her reflection, and his overlapping in its surface. She remembered every version of them, the strangers in the rain, the silence after the scandal, the rebuilding, the laughter, the forgiveness. Then softly she said, You know what I told you once, that you can't buy back trust. He nodded, waiting. You didn't buy it, she said, her voice trembling. You earned it. She placed her hand over his, closing his fingers around the glass box. Yes, she whispered. The single word felt like an exhale she'd been holding for a year. Ethan's breath caught as relief and joy flooded his expression. He laughed quietly, then pulled her into his arms. They stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by color and light. And when their lips met, it wasn't cinematic or perfect, it was real. The kind of kiss that felt like coming home after a long storm. Outside, rain tapped softly on the glass walls, streaking down in silver lines. The children's paintings reflected in each drop a kaleidoscope of hope and renewal. Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "You really went to pick up someone else," he murmured, "and somehow you found me." She smiled. "You weren't the one I expected," she said, "but you're the one who stayed." They laughed quietly, lost in their own world. The gallery lights dimmed further as the rain deepened into a steady rhythm. Grace looked around at the paintings glowing under soft lamplight, at the hands of children signing joy at the foundation that had risen from ruin. "We built something good," she said. Ethan nodded. "We built home." Later that night, after everyone had gone, they stepped outside hand in hand. The air smelled of wet earth and lavender. The city lights shimmered on the puddles like tiny constellations. They didn't bother with umbrellas. The rain fell gently, soaking through their clothes, blurring the past into something beautiful. Grace tilted her head back, laughing softly as droplets kissed her skin. Ethan watched her, his heart full. "You know, he said some mistakes are worth repeating." She looked at him, smiling through the rain. "Then let's never stop making them." They walked down Pine Street slowly, their hands intertwined, the glow from the gallery spilling behind them like a trail of light. Above them, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, but neither cared. The world around them could have vanished, and they wouldn't have noticed. In the hush between heartbeats, in the rhythm of rain and breath, everything felt exactly as it was meant to be. The narrator's voice, calm, steady, almost reverent, seemed to echo the pulse of the city itself. She only went to pick up her cousin's best friend, it whispered, but fate had another passenger waiting. And sometimes the wrong turn leads you exactly where you belong. They disappeared into the soft glow of the street, two silhouettes framed by rain and light. Behind them, the gallery sign flickered one last time before steadying its reflection, dancing across the wet ground like a promise kept. The rain fell harder, but it no longer felt cold. It sounded like applause. It sounded like home. Before you go, take a deep breath and let this story sink in. Because maybe, just maybe, it wasn't just Grace and Ethan's story you were watching. Maybe you saw pieces of yourself in their silence, their mistakes, their second chances. Maybe you've loved someone who made you question everything. Or maybe you've walked away just to learn what home really meant. Stories like this remind us that connection isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It's about the quiet courage to show up again after everything falls apart. It's about believing that one small act of kindness, one wrong turn, can still lead you exactly where you're meant to be. So if you've ever been broken, if you've ever waited for a sign that it's okay to start again, let this be it. Love finds us when we least expect it. Not because we're ready, but because we need to be reminded of who we are when we care without fear. And when you think about Grace standing in the rain that once washed her world away, now laughing beneath it, you'll understand healing isn't loud. It's quiet, patient, and it begins when you forgive yourself enough to believe in something better. If this story touched you, tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you believe that mistakes can still lead to miracles. Drop a heart in the comments if you've ever been brave enough to start again. Because this space, this channel, isn't just about stories. It's about us, the ones still daring to love. After loss, to trust after betrayal, to keep our hearts open even when it hurts. So stay with me, because the next story might just be yours. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to remember that second chances are real, and never forget, Sometimes the wrong passenger, the wrong day, the wrong goodbye is just love's way of finding its road home.